October 1941. The muddy approaches to the town of Mtsensk, roughly 300 kilometers south of Moscow, where the German 4th Panzer Division, spearhead of Heinz Guderian's entire advance on the Soviet capital, is grinding forward through the autumn mud of what Russians call the Rasputitsa, the season when the roads themselves simply dissolve. Guderian's panzers have crushed everything in front of them for 4 straight months, an unbroken run of victories that has convinced most of the German officer corps the Red Army is finished as a fighting force. Then, from concealed positions along a low ridge, a Soviet tank brigade under Colonel Mikhail Katakov opens fire, and something happens that has not happened once in this entire campaign. German 37mm anti-tank rounds, the standard weapon that has punched through every Soviet tank encountered so far, bounce cleanly off the Soviet vehicle's sloped frontal armor without penetrating. German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks trade fire at close range and come away with their own armor cracked open while the Soviet machines keep coming. By the time the engagement ends, German losses are severe enough that the advance on Mtsensk stalls for days, and Guderian himself later writes that the appearance of this tank came as an extremely unpleasant surprise, describing the shock of encountering the vehicle's superiority as one of the most sobering moments of the entire Russian campaign. Its name was the T-34, and the panic it triggered inside the German high command that autumn would directly shape nearly every major tank design Germany built for the rest of the war, including several this channel has already covered in detail. To understand why the T-34 exists, and why it looks so completely unlike anything German or Western engineers were building at the time, you need to go back to a decision made almost a decade earlier when Soviet military purchasing agents acquired the rights to an American engineer's suspension design that the United States Army itself had largely rejected. Walter Christie, a brilliant but famously difficult inventor whose ideas had repeatedly been passed over by his own government, had developed a large road wheel suspension system that gave tanks exceptional speed and cross-country mobility, and Soviet designers, working through the interwar BT series of fast cavalry tanks, spent most of the 1930s refining that basic suspension concept into something genuinely their own. By the late 1930s, engineers at the Kharkiv Locomotive Factory Design Bureau, led by a designer named Mikhail Koshkin, combined that mobility heritage with a second, equally important idea drawn from close study of the Spanish Civil War and early clashes with Japanese forces in the Far East, that a tank's survival depended less on brute armor thickness and more on the angle at which that armor was presented to an incoming round. Sloped armor was not a new concept in isolation, but Koshkin's team pushed the idea further and more consistently across an entire hull than any tank built anywhere else on Earth at that point, wrapping the vehicle's front, sides, and turret in angled plates that dramatically increased the effective thickness a shell had to punch through without adding the crushing extra weight that equivalent flat armor would have demanded. Getting the design approved was its own act of stubborn will. Soviet military leadership in 1940, still deeply shaped by Stalinist purges that had already executed or imprisoned a significant fraction of the country's senior military and engineering leadership, was cautious about committing to an unproven design. And Koshkin, in an episode that has become something close to legend in Russian military history, personally led 2 hand-built prototypes on a grueling road march of nearly 3,000 kilometers from Kharkiv to Moscow in the depths of winter to physically demonstrate the tank's reliability and mobility to Soviet leadership in person, rather than rely on paperwork and factory trials alone. The trip worked, securing approval for production, but the physical toll on Koshkin himself was severe, and he fell seriously ill during the journey, dying of pneumonia only months later, never living to see the tank that bears the direct legacy of his stubbornness become the most produced armored fighting vehicle of the entire war. The finished vehicle that entered production in 1940 weighed approximately 26 to 32 tons, depending on variant and armament, considerably lighter than it had any right to be given the protection it offered. Frontal hull armor on the original T-34/7, 6 measured 45 millimeters, angled at a steep 60 degrees from vertical, a geometry that gave it an effective thickness dramatically greater than the raw number suggested, enough to defeat the standard anti-tank guns fielded by nearly every army in the world at the time of its introduction. The original main gun was a 76.2 millimeter weapon, later upgraded across the war to the far more capable 85 millimeter Z, SS-5-3 on the definitive T-34-85 variant introduced in 1944. Power came from the V2 series diesel engine, producing around 500 horsepower, a deliberate choice over the gasoline engines used by most contemporary designs, since diesel fuel proved considerably less prone to catastrophic ignition when a tank was hit. Survivability advantage Soviet crews came to appreciate the hard way across 4 years of brutal combat. Top speed reached roughly 53 kilometers per hour on good ground, with the tank's wide tracks distributing its weight across a low ground pressure footprint that let it cross mud and snow that stopped narrower track German vehicles dead. Precisely the mobility advantage that had shocked German crews from their very first encounters with it in the summer and autumn of 1941. The T-34's genuine strengths were matched by equally genuine, well-documented flaws, and unlike the polished propaganda image the tank later acquired in post-war Soviet mythology, front-line crews and their commanders complained about these flaws constantly throughout the war. The original two-man turret crammed the commander and gunner into a cramped space that forced the commander to also serve as the gunner, aiming and firing the main weapon himself while simultaneously trying to observe the battlefield, coordinate with other tanks, and command his own crew, an impossible workload that German tank commanders, operating with a dedicated gunner freeing them to focus purely on tactical awareness, exploited ruthlessly in prolonged engagements. Early production vehicles frequently lacked radios entirely, forcing units to coordinate through flag signals or by one tank commander physically leaning out of his hatch to shout at another, a communication method that made anything beyond the simplest coordinated maneuver dangerously difficult under fire. Soviet wartime production quality, driven by the desperate need to replace catastrophic losses and relocate entire factories eastward ahead of the advancing German army, meant individual T-34s varied enormously in fit, finish, and mechanical reliability, with optics, gun sights, and periscopes that were frequently criticized by crews as inferior to German equivalents even when the underlying armor and mobility genuinely outclassed anything the Wehrmacht fielded in 1941 and much of 1942. If you are finding this deep dive into the tank that reshaped armored warfare on both sides of the Eastern Front useful, hit subscribe. Takes a second, costs nothing, and it helps the channel keep making this kind of content. Following the shock at Mtsensk, the T-34 fought through the desperate defense of Moscow that winter, through the catastrophic street fighting at Stalingrad in 1942 and early 1943, where its mobility and reliability in brutal cold gave Soviet forces a genuine edge over German armor, increasingly strained by the same winter conditions that had crippled the Wehrmacht's advance a year earlier, and into the massive tank battles of Kursk in July 1943, where the T-34's limitations became painfully apparent against the newer generation of German armor this channel has already covered in detail. Against a Panther's sloped frontal armor or a Tiger's thick plate and devastating 88mm gun, the original T-34/76's weaker main weapon, an overloaded two-man turret proved a serious tactical liability, and Soviet tank losses at Kursk were severe even as the battle's overall outcome favored Soviet forces through sheer numbers, layered defensive positions, and the accompanying infantry and artillery that made the engagement far more than a simple tank versus tank contest. The lesson was not lost on Soviet designers, and by early 1944 the definitive T-34-85 variant reached frontline units, finally adding a proper three-man turret that freed the commander from also having to aim the gun alongside the far more powerful 85mm weapon, and for the first time as standard equipment rather than a rare luxury, a radio in every single vehicle rather than only a handful of command tanks per unit. That upgraded T-34-85 formed the armored spearhead of Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944, the massive Soviet offensive that shattered Germany's Army Group Center and arguably did more damage to the German war effort in a single summer than any other operation on any front, and it carried Soviet forces the rest of the way through Poland and into the ruins of Berlin in the spring of 1945, fighting alongside the heavier IS-2 this channel has also already covered in the same brutal urban combat that city's final defense demanded. Across the entire war, Soviet and later Eastern Bloc factories built somewhere in the range of 84,000 T-34s of every variant, a production figure that dwarfs every other single tank design fielded by any nation in the entire conflict. More than the Sherman, more than every German tank type combined many times over, a number that reflects both the sheer scale of the Eastern Front and the fundamental design philosophy Koshkin's team had committed to from the very beginning, that a tank simple and cheap enough to build by the tens of thousands, even one with real and documented flaws, would ultimately matter more to the outcome of an industrial war than a smaller number of more sophisticated machines. The T-34's service life extended remarkably far beyond 1945. Production continued in the Soviet Union into the late 1940s and in licensed factories in Czechoslovakia and Poland well into the 1950s, and the type saw extensive combat again in the Korean War barely 5 years after the guns fell silent in Europe, facing American Shermans and the newer Patton series in engagements that echoed, in miniature, exactly the same tactical debates that had defined its performance against German armor a decade earlier. T-34S continued serving in the armies of dozens of nations across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia for decades afterward, and remarkably, examples of the type remained in at least nominal service or storage in a handful of countries well into the 21st century. In July 2022, during the opening months of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, a T-34-85 that had stood as a static war memorial in the city of Lysychansk since 1971, tank number 227 was pulled from its concrete pedestal and used by defending forces as an improvised roadblock during the battle for the city, a tank built to commemorate a war fought 8 decades earlier, finding itself, however briefly and however static its actual combat role that day, back on a battlefield in the same country it had once helped liberate. Mtsensk was far from the T-34's actual combat debut, only its first widely documented tactical shock delivered under competent leadership. Weeks earlier, in the final days of June 1941, in the opening days of the German invasion, Soviet mechanized corps had thrown hundreds of T-34S and the even heavier KV-1 into the Battle of Brody, sometimes called the Battle of Dubno-Brody Rivne, in what remains one of the largest tank engagements in history by sheer number of vehicles committed, larger in raw numbers than the far more famous clash at Kursk 2 years later. On paper, Soviet armor at Brody should have crushed the advancing German panzer divisions outright, since German tanks of 1941 genuinely could not reliably penetrate the T-34's frontal armor at most combat ranges. In practice, the battle turned into a Soviet defeat, not because the tank itself failed, but because the surrounding command structure did. Soviet formations attacked piecemeal rather than concentrated, radios remained scarce or entirely absent in most units, fuel and ammunition resupply broke down within days, and German forces, unable to win the technical duel, simply outmaneuvered and encircled the disorganized Soviet columns using combined arms tactics and air support the Red Army could not yet match. The lesson embedded in that early defeat, that a technically superior tank counts for very little without the doctrine, communication, and logistics to actually employ it, shaped Soviet armored reform for the rest of the war just as powerfully as any individual engineering fix to the tank itself, and it is precisely the gap Mtsensk and Katakov's brigade, fighting with far better organization months later, finally began to close. The T-34's post-war identity became something considerably larger than its battlefield record alone, evolving into one of the most recognized symbols of Soviet military power throughout the Cold War, mounted on pedestals in thousands of towns and cities across the former Soviet Union and its allied states as a permanent monument to victory in what Russia still calls the Great Patriotic War. That same ubiquity as a monument rather than an active weapon is precisely what made its brief, improvised reappearance on a real battlefield in Lysychansk in 2022 so striking to military observers and historians alike, a tank whose design lineage runs directly back through 80 years of continuous military history, from a stubborn Ukrainian-born engineer's fatal winter road march to Moscow, through the mud outside Mtsensk, through Stalingrad and Kursk and the fall of Berlin, into the Cold War symbolism of a nation's victory memory, and finally, however briefly and however static, back onto a contested road in the same country where so much of that original history had actually been written. Return to the muddy ridge outside Mtsensk, October 1941. A German panzer division that has not lost a major engagement in 4 months of continuous advance runs headlong into a tank its intelligence services never adequately warned it about, and for the first time in the entire campaign, German anti-tank rounds simply fail to do their job. Every criticism of the T-34 was accurate and understood by the very crews who fought and often died inside it. Its cramped two-man turret left commanders dangerously overloaded through most of the war's critical middle years. Its early production quality was inconsistent, its optics inferior, its radios absent from most vehicles until 1944 forced a fix. Against the best German armor this channel has covered in previous videos, a T-34 fighting on purely equal terms, gun for gun and armor for armor, frequently lost. And yet, in the specific brutal arithmetic of the war, the Soviet Union actually had to fight a war of retreating factories, catastrophic early losses, and an enemy that needed to be stopped immediately rather than eventually. It worked, not because any single T-34 was the best tank on the battlefield in any given year, but because 84,000 of them existed when German industry could build only a fraction of that number of considerably more refined machines. It was never built to win a fair fight against a Panther or a Tiger. It was built so there would always be another one behind the first, and behind that one, another, until the arithmetic itself became the weapon, one that eventually helped force every major army on Earth, including the very German engineers who had once dismissed it, to rebuild their own tank doctrine entirely around the shock of what a sloped hull and a diesel engine had proven possible on a muddy ridge outside a small Russian town in the autumn of 1941.